Hey everybody, this is Mr. Mazzoro, and today we're going to start talking about plant reproduction. Now, remember what I said at the very beginning of our journey in botany together? I said that a lot of people think plants are underevolved because they can't do math, they can't move, they can't think, they don't have nervous systems. But just because plants can't do those things doesn't mean they haven't spent their evolutionary energy getting really good at other stuff. Yeah, they can't build buildings, but that's because plants dedicated basically all of their evolutionary energy to reproduction, to having sex, or reproducing without necessarily having sex, asexual reproduction. And so understanding all the different ways that plants can reproduce is actually a pretty good backdoor way into understanding the nature of all plants. And that's what I'm going to try to do during this unit. We're going to start off really basic today. We're just going to talk about how plants reproduce. And then we're going to talk about types of sexual reproduction in plants versus asexual reproduction in plants. And then we're going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of each type of reproduction. Why plants would want to reproduce sexually, or why some plants would rather reproduce asexually. So, reproduction. Put simply, it's making a new individual organism. As long as you start as long as you end with more organisms than you started with, you reproduce something. Now, that could happen in two ways in plants. The first, we know, sexual. And don't be mistaken here. People, again, hear sexual reproduction in plants, and they get confused. Sexual reproduction just means sperm meeting egg. Sperm from one plant fertilizes an egg from a different plant. That's all it means. That sperm can be in the form of pollen, or it could be literally sperm in ferns and mosses swimming through pools of water to fertilize female ferns and mosses. All plants reproduce sexually. That's one of the four characteristics that make plants plants. But most plants can also reproduce asexually, which is the process of creating a new individual organism from only one organism. It's basically when a piece of a single plant breaks off or is removed and then facilitated to continue growing. You start with one organism, you end with two, instead of starting with two organisms and ending with three or more. Bryophytes and ferns and mosses reproduce sexually, and it's a very simple process. If you remember from the beginning, they basically just have sperm. The male gametophyte produces sperm. That sperm swims through a film of water until it reaches a female gametophyte and her egg. It fertilizes that egg. Boom, you have sexual reproduction. Gymnosperms and angiosperms reproduce sexually a completely different way. Instead of depending on sperm and water, they depend on sperm and wind, specifically pollen. The fancy name for sexual reproduction in gymnosperms, cone plants, and angiosperms, flowering plants, is cross-pollination. And cross-pollination can take place usually from animals like bees or hummingbirds, or also from wind, and it's basically just those mechanisms carrying pollen, sperm, from one organism to the eggs of another organism. Asexual reproduction is a little bit more complicated. Plants can reproduce asexually in a number of different ways, and here's some of them. The first is modified underground stems. Rhizomes, tuber, bulbs, runners, stylons. All of these plants, bulbs like onions, corms like that you see, like bulbs like tulips, rhizomes such as ginger, runners like you see with strawberry plants, and then tubers like you see with potatoes. All of these are modified stems that can be broken in half or snapped in half and planted in two different positions, and will generate from one plant two different plants. Will make two separate plants. It's not sexual reproduction because there's no sperm and egg. Both those plants are exactly the same, carbon copies. Other ways that plants can reproduce are cuttings. This is when a piece of a plant is removed, planted, and generates a new plant. This is actually how most nursery plants are made. If you notice, all nursery plants, you buy them in those flats and they all look basically the same. And that's because generally the way nurseries make their money is they have one big mother plant that they chop up into a million pieces, and then they sell you the million pieces of the one big mother plant. Grafting. Grafting is a version of cuttings, only now the piece that you cut off of a plant won't root by itself. So instead, you take that piece and you jam it in a similar plant, a pre-rooted similar plant. And usually, if these two plants are similar enough, they'll fuse together. You'll have the genetics of the root stock on the bottom and the genetics of the plant that you wanted on top, and all of a sudden, you have basically an asexually reproduced plant growing out of another asexually reproduced plant. You have a version of cuttings that originally this piece of it, the upper piece of it, wouldn't root. Again, cloning though, asexual reproduction. There's no difference between this top piece and the plant that you cut it off of. You start with one plant, you end with two. You don't start with two and you end with three. Lastly, there's self-pollination. Most flowers can self-pollinate, meaning transferring pollen within the same flower or transferring pollen from flowers on the same plant. Both of those would produce plants that are basically genetically identical for all intent and purposes. And so, they're asexual reproduction because you're not involving a second plant's eggs, you're involving the same plant's eggs. Why would plants want to reproduce sexually? Put simply, diversity. Genetic diversity creates a more diverse population, and therefore, when something happens to that population, you get a variety of resistances to that pressure. In other words, if you have a bunch of different types of apples, and all of a sudden there's a fire, maybe 99 out of those 100 apples would die in that fire, but one of them, through some fluke genetic modification, is a little bit more flame retardant than the rest. Maybe it produces bigger, more watery fruit. All of a sudden, you have a survivor from an evolutionary pressure, like a fire. If you look at all these different types of apples, all of these different types of apples are the result of sexual reproduction. Sperm from one apple plant fertilizing the eggs from another apple plant, producing very slightly different apples. If something were to happen, if there was a field of all these apples and something were to happen to that field, yeah, you'd probably kill most of them, but maybe some of them with the diverse genetics would survive. The problems with sexual reproduction is that each generation is a little different from the parents. The problem with asexual reproduction is that when you go to the store, you want all your Granny Smith apples to be the same. So if we allow that Granny Smith apple to keep on sexually reproducing, they won't all be the same. They'll be a little bit different. And as a result, if we just let all of our apples sexually reproduce all over the place, we would never get two apples that were exactly the same. This is the problem with sexual reproduction. Yeah, you get genetic diversity, but that genetic diversity means your traits aren't kept consistent. And if we want our strawberries to taste like strawberries every year, our apples to taste like apples every year, all our food crops to taste consistent at all, that means we have to stick with certain types that we like to grow or certain types that grow well and disallow them to sexually reproduce. That's the only way we're going to keep them the same. There are also pros and cons of asexual reproduction. The pros of asexual reproduction is that we keep desired traits. We just copy one plant over and over again. We have one really good apple, so we just produce one huge field of that really good apple, and we know for sure that every single apple in that field is going to be the same and equally as delicious as the original one that we copied. With apple trees, it happens to be grafting. The cons of asexual reproduction is that everything's a copy. There is no genetic diversity. So when one plant gets sick or when one plant is in danger, they're all in danger. And populations can be very, very quickly wiped off the face of the earth. A good example of that would be this. You're looking at this and you've probably never seen this before. Although you have seen it before, actually this is the most common fruit in the world. This is a banana. But it's not the bananas that we eat. It's the banana that's the result of wild bananas sexually reproducing in the wild. We took those bananas and over generations and generations of sexually reproducing them, we made from this the banana that we know today. We made the meaty part larger, the skin a little bit thinner, and we took out all these teeth-shattering seeds, and we turned this basically impalatable, bland banana into this. what's known as the Gros Michel banana. Now, again, you're looking at that banana and you say, that doesn't look like the bananas that I know today. And you're right, that banana is extinct. When we made the Gros Michel banana, basically at the turn of the century, that was the greatest banana that had ever been on Earth. It was larger, more delicious, it traveled well, it was more nutritious, it was sweeter. It was so good, in fact, that we made artificial flavor, the banana artificial flavor. It doesn't taste like bananas today, it tastes like the Gros Michel banana, because that's when that artificial flavor was made. We made actual artificial flavors to mimic this banana taste. So what happened to that banana? Well, we liked it so much that we kept on asexually reproducing it. And all of a sudden, at around 1910, a fungus called Panama disease literally swept across the earth in about 10 years and literally wiped bananas almost off the face of the earth. Because all those bananas were carbon copies, all those bananas were the exact same Gros Michel banana, asexually reproduced, bananas basically went extinct. We began to scramble for any different variety of banana that was resistant to this Panama disease, so that we would still be able to eat bananas, and we found it. We found this banana. What we know as bananas, our banana, the Cavendish banana. The Cavendish banana isn't as sweet, it's not as large, it doesn't travel as well, its skin is thicker, its pulp barely tastes like anything. It's not as nutritious. It's really an inferior banana in every single way except for one. It was resistant to the Panama disease. So what did we do? Not learning from our mistakes, we asexually reproduced Cavendish bananas all over the place. And now Cavendish bananas are under threat. In about 10 years, a new disease called Panama disease race flower, related to the old one that killed the Gros Michel, is basically going to wipe Cavendish bananas off the face of the earth. So right now, there are people literally being paid millions of dollars in South American countries and major banana producing nations in order to coax a seed out of the Cavendish banana, sexually reproduce them and coax a seed out of the banana in the blind hope that maybe one of those seeds will have a slight variation to it. One of those sexually reproduced seeds will have a slight variation to it that'll make it resistant to the disease that we know is going to wipe off our bananas off the face of the earth. One thing is true. Just like we never tasted the bananas of our great-great-grandfathers and grandmothers, our children won't taste what our Cavendish bananas taste like. They will be gone by the end of the century. Because they're a monoculture. Because they're just one big crop asexually reproduced over and over again. So that's it. Plants can reproduce, make new plants via sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is basically just sperm swimming to egg, or cross-pollination, being blown to eggs. Asexual reproduction varies. You can have modified stems, you can do grafting, you can do cuttings. You also can self-pollinate a flower. All of those would produce basically clones. The advantage of those asexually reproduced plants is that they're all the same, but the disadvantage is, just like our friend the Gros Michel banana, one sickness, one disease, one environmental stress can wipe the entire population off the face of the earth because there's no genetic variance. Sexually reproduced plants have an advantage because there is that variance, but the problem is they're all different. So if we want our plants to be consistently delicious or consistent at all, we're locked into forcing them to reproduce asexually and disallowing them to reproduce sexually. In the next lesson, what I'm going to go through is I'm going to go through the actual flower and the dynamics of how pollen is spread from one flower to the next. So stay with us.